Half a moment after the figure had appeared, Xander felt a tremendous impact on his armored shoulder and heard a sharp crack as the crossbow bolt impacted on his left side. The force was so great it threw him from Freya's saddle. He let out a strangled, "Ah, damn!" as he hit the ground. Rolling to his feet as quickly as he could manage, given the situation, he tried to assess himself. It wasn't hurting yet, likely due to the adrenaline. The unsettling crunch he'd heard as the bolt had impacted and then bounced off his armor led him to believe that something was broken. He couldn't tell if it was his collarbone or the shoulder itself, but he was having trouble lifting his left arm. Xander looked about to see that there were several more figures with various ranged weapons on top of other nearby roofs. VA that his teammates were already engaged with them, though it appeared he was the only one struck. He watched as Fraze nimbly stepped aside and an arrow skittered against the cobblestone road. Atrax was burning arrows into ash as they flew towards him. Graphus was presumably still in the carriage, ensuring that Alesse was shielded. Several bolts and arrows decorated the outside of the carriage already, and he could hear Alesse's muffled voice shrieking in fear, though it did not sound like she was in pain. Gabriel was already rushing towards him, and Freya was letting loose a growl of such intensity that nearby windows were rattling. "We have to get the cart out of here!" Atrax shouted, waving his hand as another crossbow bolt turned to ash in front of him. He ran towards the carriage, where the driver was cowering behind what little cover he could. "Move!" Atrax screamed at the man. "Get back to the estate!" He then slapped the rear of one of the horses that had been pulling the cart, startling the animal into a run. Xander's admittedly little-used combat training finally asserted itself, and he sprinted into the first spot of cover he could find. "Go with the cart!" he shouted to Freya. "I'll be fine, but you're going to end up getting hit out here." He could feel her reluctance through the bond, but she obeyed his order, quickly catching up the carriage. If anything, the horses began to run faster as they realized a predatory cat that was even larger than they were was chasing them. He tried again to lift his left arm, but only succeeded in moving it a few inches. He felt something grating in his shoulder area as he tried. "Damn," he cursed to himself. He wasn't going to be able to use the shotgun like this. Allowing the shotgun to slip back into his inventory, his 9mm pistol appeared in his hand. Normally, he'd doubt he'd be able to land a hit at all on a moving target at that range with a pistol, but he hoped that weapons of war would allow him to exceed his normal limits in that regard. Popping up from his small piece of cover, the stone column of a lamppost, Xander searched the roofs nearby for a target. Unfortunately, his target spotted him slightly before Xander did and had loosed a crossbow bolt at him. Time seemed to slow down for Xander. While he did not think the crossbow bolt would penetrate his armor, there was still the danger of the impact. He already had one broken arm, he couldn't afford another broken bone. There was also the distinct possibility of it striking his chest with enough force to stop his heart, like being kicked by a horse. He didn't think crossbows were supposed to hit that hard. His mind raced for ways to avoid being struck before latching onto one of his skills. Focusing as hard as he could on the steel tip of the bolt that was hurtling towards him, Xander activated ferrokinesis, pouring as much willpower into it as he could. Both he and his target were surprised to see the bolt stop several feet from him, hovering in the air, before Xander released it from the grasp of his skill for it to clatter onto the street. The shock of the crossbowman of seeing his arrow halted in such a way proved to be his undoing, as Xander recovered faster than he did. Once again feeling weapons of war guiding his arm, he pointed his pistol at the figure on the roof and pulled the trigger. The small crack of the runically silenced pistol was accompanied by the muzzle flash of the gases escaping from the barrel, and the figure collapsed onto the rooftop before slipping out of view. Fraze and Atrax were still engaged by several bowmen. He only noticed that Gabriel had reached him when she called out to him. "Xander, are you okay?" She shouted over the chaos of skills being thrown about the street. "Your arm looks broken. Get into cover," he shouted back at her, waving his pistol to the column he had just stepped out from. "I'll be fine until things are over." Xander realized that he would heal perfectly fine due to his regenerative passive skill, but that didn't stop his shoulder from throbbing in pain as he continued moving. Xander was furious at this point. The shock of the ambush had worn off, and the pain of his wound was setting in. These bastards had shot at him, were still shooting at his teammates. had tried to harm a 16-year-old girl just to get to her father. These people were scum, and he had no empathy for them, and therefore no hesitation in taking them down. He activated his helmet's aura of fear and began using ferrokinesis to suck any arrows and bolts he could see off target. Screams and yells of fear began to ring out nearby as both the criminals on the roof as well as anyone hiding in the nearby buildings were struck with fear. Xander methodically began to fire his pistol at any target he could find on the roofs. The pressure of the fusillade of arrows relieved for Atrax and Fraze. They were able to return fire more accurately as well. Atrax conjured and began using a long, flaming whip to crack strikes upon those within his reach, and Fraze was firing arrows faster than even Xander was firing his pistol. The attackers were soon scattered, retreating from the radius of fear that Xander was putting out, as well as from being overwhelmed. Xander tiredly let his pistol back into his inventory and leaned against another lamppost. The motion caused his shoulder to spike in pain again, and he let out a pained grunt. Gabriel trotted up to him again, hearing his pained noises. "Xander, please let me look at your shoulder. The fight is done now," she pleaded. "Okay, yeah, let's get something done about this," he ground out through gritted teeth. He willed his plate carrier as well as the armor covering his arms, his gorget, and his helm into his inventory, leaving only his camouflage blouse left. Gingerly, he unbuttoned the blouse one-handed and did his best to shrug it off, revealing a tan t-shirt underneath. "I don't think I can get this off by myself with my arm like it is," he said. "Can you help me? I don't really want to have to cut it off." Gabriel nodded and had him lean forward and hang his other arm out in front of him, much like his broken one was already doing, and slid the shirt off his body. The shirt jostled his shoulder slightly as it was removed, and he hissed in pain again. "Thanks," Xander said through his clenched teeth. "Here, sit," Gabriel commanded. Carefully, so as not to move his arm any more than necessary, Xander sat down on the road. Gabriel kneeled down and peered at his shoulder and collar area. Xander followed her gaze and saw a large bruise already spreading across the front of his shoulder where the bolt had struck him. She moved her hands to the bruised area, the soft blue glow of her class's skills enveloping her hands. "Damn, looks rough," Xander commented. Gabriel looked up momentarily from her hands and whatever it was she was able to see with her skills. "It's not great, but it could certainly be worse. It's a relatively clean break. Fortunately, it wasn't shattered by that hit. I should be able to set the bone and reduce some of the bruising now, and with a few more applications of my skills, you should be back to normal in a day or two. Now hold still, and let me set it." The light surrounding Gabriel's hands flashed brighter momentarily, and Xander felt something shift in his shoulder, which was accompanied by a sharp pain. "Ah!" he cried, from startlement as much as the pain. "Sorry," Gabriel said with an apologetic smile. "The rest shouldn't be painful. I'm just going to reduce the bruising and the swelling." Her hands again glowed brighter, though not as bright as they had when she'd set his shoulder, but this time the glow stayed. She slowly moved them over the severe bruise, and slowly, the throbbing pain in his shoulder subsided. He held still, though, as of yet still reticent to move the arm. The glow faded from her hands, and she stood up. "There, that should hopefully be the worst of it. You're still going to be very sore, and you're not going to have full range of motion yet, but you should at least be able to move it. Give it a try." Xander followed the command, experimentally lifting his left arm. He was able to lift it enough to be able to use it, but not with much strength, and it was quite sore to move. Still, it was an improvement from its previous state. Xander sighed, relieved to be rid of the constant pain. "Thanks, Gabriel. That would have been hell to wait and heal on my own, especially with needing to get back to the estate." He looked around at his teammates, who were still on guard, watching for any stragglers or counterattacks. "Anyone else need any healing?" he called to them. Atrax waved an all clear, and Fraze responded, "Nope, I'm good. I can feel that Freya is okay, so I'm hoping Graphus and the cart are fine and at the estate," he said loudly enough for all three of them to hear him. "The bond is pointing in that direction, too. Should we check the fallen attackers? Do we alert the guard or something, too?" "Checking them is probably a good idea. Doubt we'll find much, but it's worth at least making sure. And I expect the guards are already on the way, judging by how much screaming there's been," Atrax replied. "Oh yeah, that makes sense," Xander belatedly realized he should turn Aura of Fear off, summoning his helm for a moment to do so. Contact with the item seemed required to activate or deactivate the ability. He was glad he remembered to do so, as soon after, several guards, some armed with crossbows, appeared around the bend. Freze was still searching the belongings of the attackers that had fallen from the rooftops, so Xander, Atrax, and Gabriel made their way to meet the guards, Xander still shirtless and sporting a nasty bruise. As the three of them drew closer, the guards with crossbows leveled them at the party, and one of them barked, "Stop! State your business!" "We were ambushed," began Atrax, "while fulfilling our bodyguard contract for Lord Haraven." He withdrew his mercenary charm as proof that he was indeed a member of the guild. "We sent the carriage on with some others from our group and fought back." He gestured at the fallen attackers. "Obviously, we won." The lead guard, the one who had called for them to halt, nodded along with Atrax's story, mulling things over. We were informed of that contract, and you do meet the description of the mercenaries that were hired well enough, and the scene here seems to corroborate an ambush, like you said. Came at you from the rooftops, I see. Still a couple of them up there I can see. Learn anything of use from any of them?" Atrax shook his head, just shouting and shooting. "The only ones down here were down by the time they hit the ground." Freze called out from her position by one of the fallen men, saying, "They've all got a little stamped coin on them. 2 daggers on one side and a skull on the other." The lead guardsman nodded again. "That'd be the group Lord Haraven's been looking into, all right. Just about any member who's worth anything to the bone daggers carries one of them." He sighed before turning to his subordinates. "All right, you lot. Somebody go fetch a cart so we can get these worthless lumps off the street, and a ladder, too." "Is there anything you need from us?" Xander asked, eager to return to the manor and hopefully have his arm fixed even more, though he had to admit it was already feeling much better. "Nah, nothing I need from any of you. I believe your story and it lines up with how these guys do business. Besides, I know where to find you if I need to ask any follow-up questions." Xander nodded, and he and the rest of the team began making their way back to the manor. As they were walking and Xander was buttoning his blouse back over his torso, a thought struck him. "Did you find anything good, Freze?" Freze smiled crookedly. "Oh, nothing much. Just some pocket change, some knives, and, a pre-written ransom note with where Lord Haraven should meet to negotiate the release of his daughter." "What?" Xander and Atrax both shouted at the same time. "Why didn't you tell the guard?" Xander asked. "Shouldn't this go to them immediately so they can, raid the place or something?" "Who do you think runs the guard?" Freze asked. "We give this to Haraven, and he'll jump on this information faster than it would travel through that guard to his boss, and his boss's boss, and so on and so forth. It would just end up on Haraven's desk, but a day or two later instead of tonight." Xander nodded slowly. "I see. That makes sense. And I suppose the guard would have demanded to take the note if you'd mentioned it." "Oh yes, they love their evidence, the city guard does." As they continued their way back to the Haraven estate, Xander checked his status. "You have defeated enemies. Bonus experience awarded for first defeat of an enemy of this type." Xander realized that he had taken down another opponent for the first time. He felt slightly sick to his stomach. "Soldier leveled to 6. Soldier level 6 skills, reactive armor. When cast, the next strike upon you is diverted by an explosive blast. Mana cost, low. Class synergies detected. Artificer, Soldier, and Demolitionist classes combined. Class Combat Artificer granted at level 18. Empty class slot detected. Please select a class from the following list: Farmer Trader Smith Magus, Lightning, Criminal Rune, Lord Tinkerguard, Ranger Mounted Knight." Xander stopped in his tracks, overwhelmed with too much information to process while walking at the same time. His classes had combined? That was what Freze had called it. Class amalgamations. His classes had fused together into Combat Artificer. All of his previous skills were still there, but now under the umbrella of a single class. He could already feel how his passives that scaled with level were more powerful now than they had been, having jumped from at most level 7 to level 18. And he had new options to choose from. He recognized the classes that he'd been presented before, when he'd been told that he would be translocated. The thought of how he'd been ripped from his home still rankled him. But now there were newer and more interesting choices open to him. "Everything okay, Xander?" Frazee asked, noticing that he had stopped. Atrax also stopped and looked at him. Yeah, I'm okay," he said, mind still on his new choices. "I was just checking my status and my classes. They all, what did you call it? They all amalgamated, and then I got a list of classes to pick to fill my empty second slot." Atrax's eyebrows rose. "All three amalgamated? That's impressive. Usually just two classes bind together like that. Must have been quite the maximum level boost, eh? Congratulations, by the way." "Thanks." Xander trailed off as they resumed walking, and he continued staring at the list of available classes. He was pretty sure he knew which one he would pick, though. While Tinker and even Mounted Knight held some appeal, Rune Lord seemed too interesting to pass up. Runes had opened up so much utility to him already through his single rune etching ability. He couldn't even begin to imagine how a class like Rune Lord would increase his abilities to work with runes, but he knew that it would be immense. With a little bit of trepidation, he selected the class. Class choice accepted. Generating class skills. Rune Lord level 1 skills. Engraved in memory, increased intelligence. Scales with level. Rune Library provides access to a library of runes. More runes become available with increased levels. Runic lordship power and efficiency of runes is increased. Brand. Mark an enemy within 30 feet with a rune of energy absorption. Health and mana will be restored to the caster over time. Rune Etching and Rune Library produce Rune Master's Library. Rune Master's Library. Vastly increased knowledge of runes and rune behaviors. Xander stumbled as a huge lake of knowledge was suddenly pumped into his mind. Fortunately, he was saved the embarrassment of his teammates noticing as he was walking slightly behind them. It hadn't been quite as painful a process as when he'd learned how to access his status sheet, or even when he'd gotten rune etching. There was almost a degree of separation, and he got the feeling that it was almost sourced outside himself, that he was granted access to by the Rune Master's library skill, and that the skill would function almost like a boat in the lake of knowledge, allowing him to safely access the vast array of knowledge now available to him in more digestible amounts. Coupled with engraved in memory, allowing him to memorize things more easily with an increased intelligence, it was an incredible skill, giving him access to a huge amount of utility, both in and out of combat. The four mercenaries made the rest of the walk back to the Haravan estate in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. When they reached the gate, it was obvious that the household was in a state of alarm, as the number of guards was far higher than the 2 that were usually stationed there. They were greeted by a full 10 guards at the gate, armor reflecting the light of the nearby street lamps. If you love engaging stories like this, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to stay updated with all the latest episodes from FY Stories.